And I'm going to focus on knowledge and skills needed for a fast-growing young technology company. And it's based on research that I've been doing. So it's with the idea that by taking a kind of a deep look at one company, you can generalize to some of the wider trends. So to introduce some of these wider trends, I'd like to just tell a little story. When I was on a train one time, I was arriving at the St. Lazare Station in Paris, which is one of the 4 or 5 big, beautiful train stations in Paris. And it has this incredible wrought iron architecture and glass, so when you get off the train, it's very impressive. And I was sitting behind... Can you hear me better now? Yeah. Okay, good. So I was coming into the St. Lazare Station, and I was sitting behind 2 Americans. One of them clearly lived in Paris, and another was visiting his friend, and it was obviously the first time he'd ever been into the St. Lazare Station. So as the 2 of them got off the train, I was right behind them, and the visitor looked up, and he goes, "Wow, what is this place?" And his friend turned to him and said, "This is my screensaver." Make the most of it. It's the only funny part of my presentation. So that's my way of introducing the wider context of this company. I should have prefaced that by saying that was back in the good old days of desktop computers. So this is an e-commerce company. So I situate e-commerce in this very wide view of the age of information and telecommunications, so I'm sure I'm not saying anything new to anybody in this room by saying that's the age that we're currently in, at least according to the theory of Perez and other sort of similar theories. Modern e-commerce goes back to the late 1990s, and according to this theory, the dot-com crash of 2000 represents a major technology bubble, which is very typical of this kind of revolutionary technology about halfway through the assimilation process. So e-commerce today still has a lot of room for growth. According to the facts and figures that I've dug up, e-commerce appears to be a relatively small portion of worldwide retail sales. And the growth rate is about 3 times that of traditional brick and mortar retail. That's particularly important for the French context because in France, we just struggle to have the tiniest bit of economic growth. And ever since I've lived there, I've been living there for 20 years. And every year it's like, okay, we're gonna reduce unemployment this year. No, this year we really are going to reduce unemployment. And it just stagnates. So this is a sector that's growing, really growing, and the company that I was doing research on hires people right out of school. There's lots of jobs potentially in this sector. But it is becoming more competitive as companies know more about it. There's bigger players, there's consolidation. Amazon is entering the apparel, retail, e-commerce. And that's significant, of course. So the purpose of my study was to assess the knowledge and skills possessed by the employees of this e-commerce firm, and to make the link between these firm-specific tacit skills and the long-term competitive advantage of the company. And it was also to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the learning processes of the company. I'll mainly talk about the first 2. The third one takes me off into another kind of branch of the study, which I won't really have time to talk about, but if you're interested in organizational learning processes, I'd be glad to talk to you about that during the break. The company history is presented to you on this slide. I got in touch with this company by going to a party and talking to a friend of a friend. And he explained to me the company he worked for, and we had an interesting conversation. And he was interested in the learning processes of his company. He was interested in the concept of a learning organization. So that's why he invited me into the company to engage this kind of research. So the company is about 9 years old, and it was founded by three very young people, late 20s, early 30s. One of them had an eye for fashion and photography. The other was really strong in business models, financing, and the third person had a lot of experience in e-commerce. So the three of them founded this company, and they recognized that there was this need for full-service e-commerce in the apparel sector because the apparel brands didn't really know what they were doing when it came to e-commerce. So they offered a full package. We'll do everything for you. We'll set up your websites. We'll take care of the stock, the logistics, and even the customer service. So when the final consumer has something to say about the product, they call this company, which is centralizing all the operations of e-commerce. And this was quite a successful business model for apparel brands in France. The company grew very quickly. After 6 years of its creation, it had 90 people, 17 big apparel brands. And today, the company has about 115 employees, about 30 brands, and it's growing at the rate of about 30% a year. But it's a really dynamic, somewhat unstable environment. Only until a few months before I started my research did they even have an HR manager. So there's high growth. There's also high staff turnover. People come in, people leave, people come in, people leave. They didn't have much in place in terms of formalized management processes. So the company, the culture of the company, very, very trendy, like a lot of young technology companies. They sort of minimize any external signs of power. Everyone's wearing, jeans and T-shirts, and you can't tell who's the boss of whom. Open space, it's in a kind of a loft atmosphere. They had taken over a refurbished parking garage. So they had 2 floors of this building that used to be a parking garage in central Paris. And so you walk in, it's just big open tables and people working in this open space environment. And like I said, a lot of very young employees hired right after they get out of school, mainly for their technical skills. And one of the special things about this company, and probably one of the keys to its success, is combining the marketing expertise and the technical expertise. So that's how they managed to get their clients with this full service offer of not only do we know how to do this technically, but we can help you develop your strategy and your whole marketing campaign. So according to the head of sales and strategy, they have no real competitors locally, which doesn't mean there's no competition. It's just the competition is coming from different types of entities, companies who are doing their own e-commerce, especially big groups. We can call that competition. The threat of Amazon coming in is, of course, a big threat in terms of competition. But locally, for what they do, they've really dominated. The other companies have more or less given up. They're in the process of reorienting their strategy. Even though they've been quite successful, that doesn't necessarily mean they've been profitable. And so they're looking at a more tailored approach to their sales strategy right now, based on more specific client needs. And they're also trying to develop their own e-commerce platform, which then they hope to license to clients and to generate revenue that way. So I tried to find some examples of some old websites. I thought it'd be interesting to see a little bit how websites have evolved. Wasn't easy to do, but I just came up with a couple late 1990s websites. This is an old one from Nike from 1998. This is one from The Gap, also late 1990s. And this image is closer to what the company's doing today. This is not actually one of the company's websites, but it's close. And they were innovative insofar as they anticipated the need to make e-commerce transaction a whole experience. So when they set up their websites, their concept is really the e-store, the full experience, and that to them was, I mean, a huge leap, not just to them, but in the sector, a very different way of conceiving of e-commerce. They use artificial intelligence in the way they display their images. The choice of products is partly guided by artificial intelligence, by analyzing where the most clicks are happening, what the most popular products are, and so on. So they're experimenting with using this in some of their websites. They have some interesting consumer interfaces where consumers can ask questions to other consumers, these kinds of sort of user-generated interface technologies. So if we look at the jobs that you have in this company and the technical skills, we have, not surprising, search and referencing. We have traffic analysis, customer relations management, and as I said, they do the full service for a lot of their clients, so they're doing supply and logistics. That involves some systems, some software. Of course, they do web development, web design, integration. They have IT designers, IT architects. People who work in the company have to use the e-learning platforms, which are not proprietary for the company, but they use somewhat standard platforms right now, like one is called Magento, another one is called Lengro. A lot of the employees learn these on the job. There's analyzing transactions, especially in the anti-fraud department, looking for patterns of which types of transactions, certain locations, certain products, and certain prices sometimes can be a red flag for fraud. Then you have your managers, your brand managers, your account managers, your e-store managers who are working closely with the client. They're developing activities in digital growth management, online marketplaces, so that takes them outside of these e-stores into lots of other channels online to sell their products. And then you have your functional jobs like sales, finance, and human resources, but like I said, human resources is relatively recent at the company. But I wasn't really interested in any of that. I was interested in this. Why do I have the image of a bike on the screen? Because I was focused mainly on tacit skills rather than the technical skills. And bike riding is a good way of illustrating what I'm talking about. Because if I would suppose that probably many of you know how to ride a bike. But if I asked you to explain very rationally, step by step, how to ride a bike, I think you'd find that challenging. And if I asked you to write a manual about how to ride a bike, I think you'd find that very challenging. And I'm not sure it would be that valuable, unless, of course, bikes ceased to exist on planet Earth. Nobody knew how to ride a bike, and the only trace we had was somebody's very carefully, meticulously written book about how to ride a bike. Then we'd have something that's transferable and explicit. But for the most part, bike riding is really a tacit skill. It's very linked to doing it. It's very linked to the practice, and it's very linked to the context, even if lots of people can learn how to do it. So that's more what I was interested in. And a company, of course, is not one bike rider. a company is more like the Tour de France when you have a team of bike riders. And the bike riders have to be heading more or less in the same direction and have to be communicating with each other. There has to be some link, some relationship between the different bike riders. So if we go back to the skills in the company, we have employees that know how to use Magento and Lengro, which is the e-commerce platforms. We have employees who know how to do integration, logistics, SEO, web design, digital media. But if we took a few different companies, maybe even hundreds of companies, maybe even thousands of companies, we'd find the same skills. We'd find the same technical skills. If we're talking about e-commerce, every e-commerce company would have to have some knowledge about how to use the platforms, about how to analyze traffic. So it's really these links in between these bike riders where it gets interesting, in my view. It gets interesting because it gets more specific. And according to Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School, has done a lot of work on organizational learning. How does the entire organization learn? According to her, it's really a question of small groups. It's kind of a local learning versus a global, an entire organization at the same time. So work teams are extremely important for organizational learning. Work teams are how knowledge goes from individuals to the larger organizations, how people learn from each other on a daily basis. And even in a relatively small company, there's a lot of different types of work teams. So I was interested in this. If we look at the daily operations of websites, contact with client brands and final consumers, you have work teams who do that. They are assigned to clients, and they have to serve the client. So the brand managers is on the top, and then you have e-store managers below, and then you have your technical people, you have your after-sales people, and they're tackling the daily problems. They're looking to be better, more efficient, remove the bugs on the websites and stuff like that. And if you compare that to management, the executive director, which is the director committee, this is also a kind of work team, right? They meet about twice a month. You've got your functional managers, and then you have the president and the founder who's on the top. They're there to tackle the long-term problems that are more complicated, they're more ambiguous, there's a lot of uncertainty. So there's a lot of different ways that people work together, a lot of different configurations of work teams. Research and development, they're working on this long-term project of trying to develop the platform. It's not indefinite, but it's long-term. Compare that to project. They put together a project team every time they sign a client because they have to produce what the client wants. So they've got to set up the team to build the website, and the project manager takes over after the salespeople have signed the contract. And then you have a temporary team that's really just focused on one specific mission, which is making that website. So why did I focus on tacit skills? Tacit skills are, I think, the best link to firm-specific competencies. And what are tacit skills? They're things you know, but you don't necessarily know you know. They're anchored in practice. Riding a bike is a good example of that, as I suggested before. And organizational tacit skills, if you're looking at the whole company, are embedded in routines. And so obviously there's a lot of soft skills involved in this, communication skills and things like that. So soft skills, sometimes it's hard to separate those from personality traits. If we talk about someone being extroverted, that's really a personality trait. But if we talk about communication skills on the job, if it's linked to an activity, to a context, and it's something you can get better at, then we can say those are skills, soft skills. So those are the things that I was particularly interested in this study. And the methodology I used was both qualitative and quantitative. I used a survey called the Organizational Learning Survey, and I did semi-structured interviews, and I got about 36% of the company. I call it a convenience sample because I can't really say they were chosen randomly. I worked with the human resources person and the e-commerce manager, and some of the people were participating in the interviews because they wanted to, but I got pretty good coverage, so I think the representation of the population is reliable. So the findings, I mean, they confirm a lot of trends, a lot of things we talk about. There's a lot of research being done on this, a lot of attention being given to skills such as the ability to see the big picture, to think holistically to solve problems, the curiosity to understand how things work, recognize patterns, anticipate trends. One of the employees I interviewed used the metaphor of opening up the hood of the car and seeing how the engine works. And he said, if you want to be good at this job, he was a traffic analysis, you can't just focus on the little piece which is yours. You really have to be curious, interested in how all the departments are working together. The communication skills and soft skills, the e-store managers are constantly talking to the clients. The clients sometimes are asking for things that are not reasonable or simply not smart strategy. And so this is a constant challenge. You have to be diplomatic. You have to be credible. You have to know how to produce evidence and saying, okay, we've tried this in the past, and here are the results. I don't think this is a good idea. So it's a close working relationship with the client when you're trying to develop a strategy with the client. And the teams themselves have to share information, because if there's a little problem going on that's purely technical and the e-store managers don't know about it, and then the client discovers it, the client's not happy. Teamwork skills, e-store managers work in pairs. They call them binôme. So usually have a junior and a senior e-store manager, so they have to divide up the tasks. They have to share responsibility. Flexibility, that came up during the interviews. One of the employees says you need what's called lâcher prise, which is you have to be able to let go. If you're trying to focus on one specific way of solving the problem, it's not working. Don't take it personally, move on to something else. People management skills, the company really values autonomy. They want their employees to be proactive, so the managers have to cultivate this. Which means they can't micromanage. They have to be delegating. And one of the brand managers asks her e-store managers on a regular basis a series of questions which develops their critical thinking. Simple questions, what's the best-selling product on your site right now? How is it displayed? Is it in stock? Kind of basic stuff like that, but just to trigger them to step out of the daily grind and think a little bit more globally about what they're doing. And the ability to work in a fast-changing, uncertain environment. Sometimes these people face these very complicated problems. One of the employees was telling me how a client brand had recently been purchased by another brand, and the headquarters was in Turkey. But the warehouses were in France, and the headquarters of this brand basically had no idea what was in their warehouses. So they had no idea how to price or how to value their goods. So these employees actually had to go to the warehouse and start counting stuff on the shelves. And so there are a lot of unpredictable situations like this. It's varied. There's stress, you have to prioritize, and so on. And people are constantly learning on the job. So that's an ability you really need to have in this working environment. So to conclude, the explicit technical skills, they're absolutely essential, and you need them to get hired. They're not going to hire you if you don't know how to do SEO, or if you haven't had some experience in account management, or if you haven't been trained on data analytics. So those are things you need to get into this company. But they're not, in my view, what explains the long-term success of the company. And they're not specific, really, to the company. They're general. So the explicit technical skills, they're very intertwined in daily practice. They're intertwined with how people make decisions, with how people work together. They're intertwined with those very specific client relationships. They're all a little bit different. So these are often the differentiating factors for a company, which is to say they're difficult to imitate. And so they're closer to the bone, in a sense, and closer to an explanation of really why the company is successful. Unless you might say, well, it was a first mover. Okay, maybe it was a first mover in this brand, but how are they going to stay successful in the future? So this presentation isn't designed for me to conclude by saying business schools are doing everything wrong and you have to rethink your curriculum and so on. No, on the contrary, when I speak to colleagues, business schools are doing a lot of good things. There's a lot of movement these days towards things like this, project-based learning, experiential learning, business simulations, a focus on soft skills, holistic problem solving. There's also some specific assessment tools out there that can assess your emotional intelligence and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So the point of the presentation wasn't to say, no, you have to redesign your whole curriculum. It was just to look at a specific company and say, this is why, this is why it's important. Let's look at some examples of what happens when you're in a company and why employees who do master these things can be helpful for the company in the long term. There are challenges, of course. It's harder to assess things like this. When you build them into exercises, sometimes you have to be kind of clever, right? The students might think they're actually working on explicit skills like accounting or a strategic theory, but in a way, what you really want them to do is work on some of these other things. So there are a lot of inherent challenges to integrating this type of stuff in the curriculum. But like I said, I think a lot of schools are doing it. My son just started a first year of business school in Paris, and he's doing a bachelor's degree, and one of his courses is creative problem solving. So I thought this was a rather encouraging sign. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions about how to integrate these types of skills into curriculum, it might be interesting to discuss them. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your